Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz. I am thrilled you are here with us today. Our purpose is to share stories, ideas, and tools to help you on your diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. Let's meet this week's guest. Hello, listeners. We're taking a break from our regularly scheduled guests to introduce some bonus mini episodes. So these episodes in the next few weeks will be short, will be to the point, and promise you'll walk away with some actionable steps you can take to be an even better ally to others that are different from you. So one of the things I wanted to talk about is I recently had the opportunity to start publishing as a leadership network writer for Entrepreneur, the publication, which is very cool. And it's been really exciting to see what resonates and what doesn't resonate. And what I've been using are questions from workshops and from inspiring, inclusive leaders that they're wrestling with. So we have a Ask Us Anything feature in our workshops now with anonymous polling where people can ask really candid questions, and we are getting some candid questions. So some of the questions I've been getting, I thought we could just take a break from our regularly scheduled programming and dive into. So one of the questions I recently got was, why is diversity important to small businesses? And of course, this is very pertinent to the entrepreneur audience. So I thought, well, that's a perfect way to start. So that was actually the first article I published with them, and I'll link to it in the show notes. So don't feel like you have to memorize all the facts and figures here. It's pretty well cited with data. But the bottom line is, this great resignation, reshuffle, quiet quitting, whatever we want to talk about, isn't going away. And even with a looming recession, the labor shortages that we're experiencing will continue, especially at frontline levels. And so the takeaway I want you to have is that the workforce really is employee-driven, not employer-driven. And I spent, a dozen years in corporate before starting this business, and I've been doing, touching corporate environments now for 20 plus years. But, when I first entered, it was not that way. It was employer driven, right? You got the pension, people had 40-year retirement parties, not happening anymore. And the reason that's not happening is because people are in more control and employees have more choices. Of course, with hybrid work, can work from anywhere globally. It's been a great benefit we've recognized on our team. But most people are thinking still about leaving their jobs. Recent stats show something about 41% of folks are thinking about opting out or self-selecting out, doing a side hustle or maybe starting their own business, which a lot of women are increasingly leaving the workforce due to its lack of flexibility and, quite frankly, equal pay and not the respect that they deserve. And so the number one reason, actually, that folks are citing that they're leaving is due to the lack of inclusion. And this was studied at MIT. A great link in the article I wrote where you can dive in and learn more. But respect was also a challenge. And so I think this really calls on us as a pivot point for diversity. We have an overrepresentation with white men, presumably cisgender, straight, able-bodied white men overrepresented at the leadership level, something north of 80% inside most of organizations at that level. So if you're not mirroring, the talent of which you hope to attract at the front lines, at the leadership level, and you're not mirroring the communities and customers you want to serve at that level, you really do risk being irrelevant. And so here are some of the tools that I'd ask you to try on, if this resonates with you, businesses of any size, but especially the small to growing business, if you don't correct some of these representation challenges early on, it becomes really difficult to manage later. Because what we end up doing is hiring people like us. So affinity bias, like me bias, is a huge challenge that affects most people. We insulate our networks with people like us, and we don't even know we're doing it. It's not intentional that I only want to be friends with white people. It just happens. In fact, 75% of white people say they only have one friend of color, total. And increasingly, very few have more than one friend of color. So with like me networks draws like me talent. And we know that we get more innovation, better decisions, and growth with non-like-minded people, aka diverse groups. And so what's interesting as companies scale, if you think about my business, we have 5 people inside our business. And we do a fair job with racial representation. We are all women. We're working on that. And we don't represent right now LGBTQ or folks with disabilities. And that's something we're going to work on as we scale. But my coaching to folks is, hey, that's okay, to have not as much diversity as you like with a few people, because you can lead to some tokenism. But at 10 employees, when you start to lack that diversity, it becomes problematic, because as people increasingly have more control, over the employers that they're seeking, they look for themselves to be represented, especially when there's larger groups of people. And so they know what it's like to step into an environment where I'm not represented, and I'm probably going to be more likely to be microaggressed, meaning, those often unintentional but harmful statements that happen to folks with diverse backgrounds. And so that's when we start to see higher turnover rates, and you start to see this self-fulfilling prophecy. It's like, see, we hired diverse talent and they didn't stay. Oh, yeah, that is the blame game. It's often not them, it's you. And I encourage organizations to look in the mirror and say, what are we doing to not create an inclusive environment where people want to stay? Because hiring and recruiting for diversity is pointless if you don't have a place that warrants retention of diverse groups. And so the absence of diversity really prevents innovation. And I think if you really dial in on this as an organization and ask, what perspective are we missing? How could we better mirror the communities and consumers we hope to serve? This can really bring up the pain points, especially as startups grow and scale, double to triple digit employees. There's this natural progression I see at 50 or fewer employees. There's not usually somebody that's managing people, like a chief people officer or an HR leader. And it usually falls on the shoulders of the C-suite, the CFO, COO, CMO, CEO, of course, et cetera. But then, somewhere beyond 50 employees is usually a sweet spot to bring on an HR person. And their job usually is to recruit and hire talent because the company's growing. So training, culture work, lovely to have, but often a nice to have, not must have part of that job. When you creep up into the thousands of employees, that's when you can get a diversity person, right? A chief diversity officer, someone leading the way. And of course, there's ways to build employee resource groups as you scale, and diversity councils or committees doing the work. But pay those people because that is extra work. Diversity work is work, and it should be compensated. But just know, this doesn't happen quickly. And so I think as companies scale, and if you can relate to this, if you're a growing organization, really think about how can we be proactive with diversity? Because once you get to a few thousand employees and you try to, change directions on that massive ship, it's much harder than when you were a smaller team. And I think the keys here are empowerment, resources, setting the expectation that we care about diversity, that's a part of everyone's job, and accountability for non-inclusive behavior. Because if we're tolerating those behaviors, they most certainly will happen more, and it will be much more difficult to recruit and retain diverse talent. So that's all I have for you this week and this bonus mini-sode. I'll come back to you with some other hot topics, but hopefully you had some takeaways as you scale your business, the importance of diversity and how to build an inclusive environment as you're growing. And I'll link to the full article in the show notes as well. Thanks, y'all, for being with us.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Allies are necessary for positive change. If you are on the journey to becoming an ally, we invite you to participate in our brand new Lead Like an Ally online program, or get a copy of our new book, Allyship in Action, available on Amazon. Both are helpful tools that meet leaders where they're at and help provide tools for professional and personal settings. Head over to nextpivotpoint.com to get started today.